Under Elizabeth I's collar always lay a snow-white shift, thin, fresh, thoroughly steeped in vinegar and rosewater. Instead of a bath, a rag. Instead of soap, fragrance. The Queen of England did not bathe for weeks and considered frequent washing dangerous, not out of laziness, but conviction. Water in the 16th century inspired fear, and cleanliness seemed like a threat, almost heresy. This fear entered flesh, rituals, royal power. Today, we will tell you how the body became politics, and why for Elizabeth, being clean meant risking her life. Elizabeth Tudor always knew the price of an image. It was her weapon, her fortress, and her curse. In the eyes of her contemporaries, she was not just a woman, but England itself, embodied in the figure of the Immaculate Virgin, framed by gold and lace. Her portraits did not convey features, they created a myth. Tightly closed lips, a cool forehead, skin devoid of blush. All this was not from nature, but from will, from the decision to become something more than a body. Elizabeth's attire was not clothing, but a statement. Skillfully embroidered sleeves, collars like wings, heavy fabrics with jewel embellishments, not for comfort, but to inspire. These dresses weighed almost as much as the Queen herself, yet she wore them with such dignity, as if the body beneath them did not exist at all, as if the physical shell had long been sacrificed for the throne. But the body still existed. It breathed, sweated, aged. It required care, and it received it within the bounds of strict, sometimes even strange rituals. The Queen bathed once a month, perhaps less, and not because she liked it, but because it was impossible otherwise. In the 16th century, water was not a symbol of purity, but a cause for anxiety. And within this anxiety lies an entire civilization, with its fears, beliefs, and sacrifices, including the body of the Queen herself. To understand why Elizabeth I hardly resorted to water procedures, one must discard all accumulated cultural baggage and momentarily forget everything you know about hygiene. In the 16th century, cleanliness did not smell of soap, did not gurgle under the shower, was not associated with bubbles and white towels. It was a metaphysical state, a sign of moderation, modesty, and reason. Dirt was not necessarily visible. It could be internal, associated with excess, lust, with a wrong understanding of the world and the body. People of the Renaissance treated their own bodies with trepidation, not in terms of care, but in terms of suspicion. It was a vessel, but not a reliable one. Poisons, weaknesses, temptations hid in the body. And the skin was considered especially dangerous, the boundary between the internal and external. According to medical theories, pores could open and let poisonous vapors, so-called miasmas, invisible emissaries of disease, into the organism. And water, especially hot water, according to doctors, opened the pores and made the body vulnerable. Therefore, bathing, with rare exceptions, was perceived not as prevention, but as provocation.
Sounds strange, perhaps, but in their logic, everything was consistent. The world was filled with foul odors, plague winds, and poisonous fumes. Hygiene, in our sense of the word, was not so much useless, it was considered potentially dangerous. A clean body was not one that was frequently washed, but one that was protected from contact with the outside. To protect oneself meant to close oneself off, literally, with dense fabric, balm, oil. Washing, especially regular washing, aroused distrust. It meant that a person did not know how to protect their body, exposed it to risk, opened the floodgates for invisible enemies. Rumors of healing baths in which people relax and refresh themselves were the domain of the East, not Europe. Here on the continent, anyone who avoided baths and washed with water only when absolutely necessary, and even then under a doctor's supervision, was considered sensible. The French physician Théophraste Renaudot wrote in the 17th century that bathing was harmful and dangerous, corrupted the body, relaxed the nerves, and filled the head with heavy fumes. His opinion was not radical. On the contrary, he said what was generally accepted. This caution towards water was not only a consequence of superstition, but also a reaction to reality. Water was rarely clean. Wells, puddles, ditches, everything mixed in one dirty flow. To spill a bath of hot water meant to awaken anxiety. And if it was heated, it was with the clear intention of curing the sick, cleansing the body of bad humors, but never for pleasure. To wash for freshness? It seemed absurd, as if someone today proposed to treat a cold by exposing oneself to an icy wind. Society was structured in such a way that any physical procedures were perceived through the prism of morality and fear. The skin did not need contact with water, but protection from it. To protect the body, it was rubbed with fat, balm, wrapped in impregnated fabric. Such rituals could last for hours. The English philosopher Francis Bacon, a strictly rational man, proposed a complex system of a 24-hour bath, where between layers of oils, resins, and linen wrappings, the human body turned into a capsule, alive on the outside, sterile on the inside. Control, not purification. Isolation, not touch. Thus, the logic of the era was formed. Moderation, density, carnal restraint. Cleanliness was clothing, literally. The white shift changed as often as possible, absorbed sweat, fat, and odors. But to wash, to rub the skin, to expose it to water, this meant invading a place where fear reigned. Therefore, rare instances of washing turned into a carefully guarded ritual, almost a ceremony, as if water itself could become a medicine only when it was subdued, when it was packed into words, signs, procedures. And it is in this context that the Queen's hygiene, her once a month, ceases to be a curiosity. It is not lagging behind the times, it is following the rules of her world.
If water does not purify, but exposes the body to disease, then what about sweat, fat, and inevitable dirt? The answer is simple. Do not wash it away. Absorb it, hide it, neutralize it. Hygiene in the 16th century was a game of interception, between smell and masking, between body and fabric, between reality and imagination. And in this game, the most important participants were objects, rags, gloves, powders, vinegars, shifts. Everything that could be placed between the body and the world, so that the body remained invisible, imperceptible, safe. Elizabeth Tudor brought all this to perfection. She not only managed without water, she created a theater of cleanliness around herself, in which every detail, every household item was a deliberate element of the scenography. Her daily bath was wet linen rags, moistened with rosewater or vinegar, with which ladies-in-waiting carefully wiped her skin. They did not rub, they touched. They did not wash away, but pacified. And, of course, they did not leave her alone. The Queen's personal body was an object of collective care and control. No one touched it without ceremony, but no one allowed it to be forgotten. Her clothing played not only an aesthetic but also a sanitary role. Underneath the heavy ceremonial dress, Elizabeth wore several layers of underwear. These shifts were not simple rags, they were delicate traps for everything that should not leave the confines of the skin. Sweat, fat, odor. Everything was absorbed, and it was believed thus eliminated. The more often a shift was changed, the cleaner a woman remained, especially if that woman was a queen. Therefore, Elizabeth was strict about this. Changing linen was a matter as important as an audience, for whiteness signified dignity. In addition to shifts, fragrance. There was a lot of it, everywhere. The scent was not just a cover, it was ideology. The Queen wore perfumed gloves not only to hide the smell of her hands, but also to create an aura of detachment. She used dry powders that absorbed oil and mattified the skin. She rubbed her face with vinegar-based mixtures to give it a freshness that could not be obtained from water. And all this in an environment where the very concepts of refreshing oneself or washing oneself meant not purification but transformation. To make the body fit for display, that was the task. Elizabeth's personal hygiene items were works of art. In the New Year's gift registry at court, a gift from the laundress was recorded. 4 linen strips sewn with black silk intended for cleaning teeth. These tooth cloths did not look like the toothbrushes we are accustomed to. They were closer to jewelry. They were supplemented by gold toothpicks and a gem-encrusted ear cleaner. These were not mundane utensils, they were status symbols, parts of the body transformed into legend. The Queen was never left unsupervised. Even her daily hygienic manipulations were ritualized and observed. Ladies-in-waiting recorded, assisted, passed fragrant fabrics. The ruler's body did not fully belong to her. It was an icon, a symbol, a state object, and therefore its service was a ceremony. And if it was a ceremony, then strictly according to the rules, nothing extra, nothing accidental, nothing spontaneous. Only proven means, only safe touches, only a blessed distance between the body and risk.
Between the infrequent baths, Elizabeth maintained cleanliness not by washing, but by layering. Instead of water, layers, fabrics, oils, fragrances, powders. Everything that could be placed between her and this anxious, fearful, painful world. She did not renounce cleanliness, she renounced naivety, and built a shield of scents, gestures, and habits around her body, which in her era was considered not just a norm, but a sign of refinement, dignity, and royal will. Of course, Elizabeth did bathe after all. Rarely, reluctantly, with caution, but she bathed. History has preserved testimonies of how these rare baths took place. They were not spontaneous desires or moments of relaxation. Each time, it was a ceremony. A transition from one form of corporality to another, an almost theatrical act, carefully planned, filled with apprehensions and ambivalent solemnity. When the Queen took a bath, the court lived in a special rhythm.
Huge copper tubs were brought from the pantries, heavy, polished, imposing. Water for them was heated in cauldrons, sometimes 3 or 4 at once. Liters, gallons, the sound of steam, the bustle of servants. Aromatic herbs were added to the water: rosemary, bay leaf, sage. Oils might be added to seal the skin after cleansing. Each substance carried not only a scent, but also meaning: protective, soothing, anti-contagious. The process took at least an hour. The body was lowered into the hot water, slowly, almost reverently. Not all at once. First the feet, then the knees, then the shoulders, if she decided on that. Steam rose, softening the air. But in this supposedly intimate scene, there was no peace. Bathing remained an act of submission to nature, which, alas, cannot be fully controlled, even if you are a queen. Ladies-in-waiting observed. Servants stood behind screens. Doctors gave instructions. Sometimes special balms were applied, which had to be applied immediately after the bath to close the pores, to give diseases no chance, and right after, wrapping. The skin was enveloped in waxed fabric, saturated with resins, myrrh, saffron. The body had to be hidden again, as if bathing itself was somehow sinful. This ritual was rare, but never forgotten. It was meticulously recorded, discussed, planned. Elizabeth might have allowed herself such a luxury a few times a year, perhaps more often, but within a regimen strictly defined by the court physician. The main thing was not the frequency, but the meaning. Bathing was not hygiene in our sense. It was the restoration of the boundary between the body and the outside, not purification, but strengthening. Such an approach was logical in a society where air itself was considered dangerous, and especially water. In letters and medical advice of that time, the thought was regularly heard: do not trust water if you do not know its source. Even washing one's face could be considered a risky affair. Well water, carelessly heated, could awaken fever in the head, cause headaches, spoil eyesight. Therefore, in everyday life, Elizabeth preferred to dab rather than immerse, with soft rags, rose water, vinegar infusions. Only surfaces, only the external, as if the body only existed in those places where it could be seen.
And beyond control, ears cleaned with a ruby-encrusted scraper, teeth rubbed with fabric ribbons soaked in vinegar, hands covered with perfume. Everything smelled: hair, gloves, underwear. Fragrance created an aura, erased the boundaries between the body and the myth. It can be said that the queen smelled better than she lived, and this too was a protection, as if the scent of lavender could ward off not only stench, but also death. Sometimes it seems that Elizabeth's entire image is a struggle against decay, against time, against diseases, against what happens to anybody sooner or later. She could not defeat it, but she could postpone it, pretend that it was not happening, turn herself into a symbol where the body is not flesh but a precious surface shrouded in fabrics, perfumes, and legend. In this sense, her bath is like a coronation, not a natural act, but a sacred act, permitted,
consecrated, controlled, and therefore so rare. Against the backdrop of her contemporaries, Elizabeth Tudor was almost a model of hygienic consciousness. If her practice of bathing once a month seems extreme to us, then next to other European monarchs, she looks almost a maniacal neat freak. Her successor, James I, for example, allowed himself to wash only his fingers, not hands, not face, fingers. French King Henry IV, famous for his military campaigns and love affairs, also became famous for his persistent, multi-layered odor. He rarely bathed, did not change clothes for weeks, and was so confident in his naturalness that he completely neglected fragrances. His son, Louis XIII, not only inherited power, but also the smell. He even boasted, "I smell of sweat, like my father." This was not irony, but a peculiar royal dignity, a sign of non-involvement in the weaknesses of civilized habits. In reality, personal hygiene was rarely associated with nobility. The nobility was closer to perfumes than to water. Bathing was associated with common people, with bathhouses, with bodily pleasures that the aristocracy considered beneath their dignity. Moreover, a bathhouse means openness, a naked body, togetherness, and therefore risk, and not only sanitary. Intrigues, meetings, conversations, the exchange of information took place in bathhouses. They were too lively. The aristocracy preferred closure and distance, even from themselves. Common people, of course, lived even more crudely. In the travel diaries of English travelers, there are descriptions of inns where clean bedding was one in which only one person had slept before you, and preferably an elderly one. One of them, Fynes Morrington, sarcastically noted that he was offered a bed after a 90-year-old woman, and this was considered normal. There was no question of water for washing. Over dozens of stops in only a few cities, Lübeck, Gansk, Elbing, he was brought a basin for his feet. Not a bath, not a pitcher, not a towel, only water for his feet. Cleanliness, in the understanding of that time, was not a physical state, but a social norm. If you were in a shift, if you did not smell of rot, if your hair was combed and your shoes were not covered in dirt, you were already clean. The internal state of the body was not subject to control. It belonged to God, chance, heredity. But the external, clothing, smell, posture, was your area of responsibility. Therefore, no one bathed, but everyone tried to smell good. Even in the poorest homes, they might keep a sprig of mint or dried lavender to throw into the linen chest. Smell, that is what was perceived as a barrier between civilization and barbarism. For the nobility, smell was a part of power. It created distance. The queen's body smelled not of sweat, but of rosewater. Her breath of vinegar and honey. Her gloves of musk. When she passed by, a trail of fragrance, not fabric, followed her. And if her clothes and body were overheated, tired, burdened by heat, her maids and ladies-in-waiting knew what to do. Bring a scented towel, wipe away sweat, not by washing, but by infusing. Thus the myth was maintained that power does not sweat, does not age, does not suffer, and does not smell. The hygienic routine was not a personal choice, but a social obligation. Those who held high positions had to hide everything bodily. This rule applied not only to smells, but also to processes. Mention of bodily needs was considered almost indecent. Even conversation about how and with what teeth were wiped was presented as a gift. 4 cloths sewn with black silk, trimmed with lace. Cleanliness had to be veiled. Not a tooth rag, but a polishing cloth. Not a toothpick, but a golden needle adorned with a ruby. That is why Elizabeth's bath was perceived as an event. Against the backdrop of her contemporaries, she was almost an experimenter, an almost innovator in matters of self-care, at least because she dared to immerse herself in water, at least because she controlled the ritual rather than avoided it. And although she was still far from the habits of the 21st century, within the framework of her era, she was a model of restraint, prudence, and aesthetic control. Hygiene, in her case, was not about soap and water. It was about power over the body. And the less often it required intervention, the stronger her crown appeared. While Europe was packing bodies in powder and ceremonies, the East was building a cult of water. And if in the West fragrance hid what could not be hidden, then in the Islamic world, cleanliness was not a mask, but a duty. Here, hygiene did not serve as pretense. It was part of faith, part of law, part of daily life. Water flowed freely, in homes, in mosques, in streets. It was not feared, not cloaked in prejudice. It was respected. Contact with it was not out of necessity, but out of conviction.
Muslim traditions required ablutions before each prayer. This meant washing the face, hands, and feet at least 5 times a day, and on Friday to perform a full ritual purification. This was not a symbol, it was a law. Therefore, baths in Muslim countries were not an exoticism, they were the basis of urban infrastructure. The poor and the rich, men and women, bathed there. There were schedules, queues, even architectural styles. Baths were subsidized by the state, visited regularly, and the absence of the habit was considered almost antisocial behavior. Europeans who found themselves in the Ottoman Empire, Persia, or the Arab East could not hide their astonishment, some with disgust, others with reverence, but almost all with envy. The traveler Henry Blount, describing his wanderings in Turkey in the early 17th century, was amazed not only by the bathhouses themselves, but also by how often and with what zeal the Turks used them. The first thing they did upon conquering a city was to build a bathhouse there. Not a church, not a market, not a fortress, a bathhouse. And this says a lot. Those who did not bathe at least twice a week were considered lazy, untidy, even suspicious. Cleanliness here was associated not with the elite, but with the norm. It was not a demonstration, but a condition for respect. And unlike Europe, where ablutions were hidden, in the East they were not ashamed. Moreover, Eastern procedures were deep, thorough, corporally frank, but not shameful. They did not fear the body, they respected it. They acknowledged that it sweats, gets dirty, ages, and demanded purification, not covering. The Swabian doctor Leonard Rauwolf, who visited a hammam in the 1570s, left a vivid description of his visit. He was first made to sweat in the steam room, then thoroughly washed, vigorously massaged, using the entire body of the bather, including knees and feet. Then, an irritating mixture of arsenic, quicklime, and water was applied to the skin to remove hair. After that, it was rubbed with soapy foam, rinsed with a coarse woolen cloth, and finally covered with a special clay paste intended to stimulate hair growth and nourish the skin. This was not hygiene, it was almost alchemy, and, more importantly, a daily routine. Rauwolf, accustomed to European restraint, perceived this experience with bewildered respect. It was unfamiliar to him,
But he could not help but admit the body felt different after these procedures. Lighter, more alive, real purification, not symbolic, but physical.
For a European of that time, especially from the nobility, such procedures seemed excessive, even barbaric. But inwardly, they understood, this is not savagery, this is a different standard, more ancient, more bodily rational. Where the West tried to hide the body, the East respected it. Where some created images, others created cleanliness. This was the paradox. If Queen Elizabeth had found herself in a Turkish bath, she might have experienced culture shock, but her skin, tired from perfumes, vinegars, and linen, would surely have received it as a revelation. Of course, she could not afford it. She was a symbol, and a symbol should not sweat. But at some point, amidst heavy dresses and sharp scents, she might have dreamed of disappearing for a couple of hours and returning from the hammam, not as a queen, but simply as a woman, with clean skin and a light body. But the human body is not just biology, it is always also ideology, and the religion of an era which rules over the soul inevitably begins to control the flesh as well. In Europe of the late 15th, early 17th centuries, it was religion that became the knife that cut hygiene from morality. Muslims, who practiced cleanliness as part of their ritual, became symbols of the other believer, and everything associated with them, including a passion for water procedures, became suspicious, heretical, dangerous. In Spain, where a highly developed bath culture existed before the expulsion of the Moors, the decline of water habits began. The Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, did not just expel Muslims, they expelled the very notion that bodily cleanliness could be something virtuous. Arab baths began to be destroyed. Water, once caressing the skin and symbolizing purification, turned into a sign of error. Under the Inquisition, washing became evidence. If someone washed frequently, it meant they were likely hiding their true faith. It meant they might not be Christian, but a crypto-Moor, or more terrifyingly, a Protestant, or simply a witch. According to a decree of Philip II in 1576, Arab baths were finally banned. Christian Moors were forbidden to use them on pain of punishment, and in this new reality, cleanliness became not a sign of piety, but proof of dangerous otherness. The ideal Christian woman was one who protected her body from temptations, did not touch herself unnecessarily, and did not expose her flesh even to water.
Legends of the era, as always, exaggerated but did not lie. Chronicles mention the story of Philip II's daughter, Isabella Clara Eugenia. When the siege of Ostend began in 1601, she allegedly vowed not to change her linen until victory was achieved. Historians debate whether this vow was literal, but the siege lasted 3 years, 3 months, and 13 days. By the time it ended, the fabric, according to rumors, had changed color, from white to yellowish brown. Not as a metaphor, but literally. This story was repeated with admiration and horror, not as an anecdote, but as an example of resilience, almost holiness. Dirt became a symbol of loyalty, refusal of water, proof of political and religious steadfastness. Cleanliness, on the contrary, required explanations. During the Inquisition, one could arouse suspicion if one cared too much about their body, washed hands too often, monitored smells too carefully. To smell good meant
to be deceitful, and those who did not smell became suspicious. And so, step by step, Europe surrendered its bathhouses. What was part of urban life in the Middle Ages disappeared. Not just the buildings disappeared, the feeling disappeared, the need disappeared. And somewhere there, in a ruined Moorish bathhouse, perhaps the last scent of incense mixed with steam was fading away. Somewhere there, the belief that water purifies not only the flesh, but also the spirit, died. The contrast with the East became increasingly stark. English travelers could not help but compare. Where Europe rejected ablutions, Turkey was building new hammams. Where linen was not changed for years, in Damascus and Istanbul, people visited baths twice a week, and this was not an excess, it was the norm. Respect for the body, for one's neighbor, for God. But for a European monarch like Elizabeth I, there was no turning back. She lived within a culture where the body was hidden, where an extra gesture of care was perceived as weakness. She could not bathe more often, even if she wanted to. Her safety, reputation, the very idea of monarchy depended on her body remaining hidden, protected, almost embalmed in life. Thus, the water-repellent image of the Queen became part of the political landscape and remained in history as a curious but accurate metaphor of the era. For in this dirt there is not only sweat and dust, in it history, fear, faith, power. And when you hear again that Elizabeth bathed once a month, do not laugh. It is not a curiosity. It is a compressed formula of the entire European 16th century, an era in which to wash meant to resist one's own culture, and sometimes even one's own destiny.